SMS Tan Kiat.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the members who have spoken for their views and support of this bill. Let me first address the points that have raised on the ESA, followed by briefly addressing the other suggestions they have made to tackle illegal wildlife that go beyond the Act. First, on the proposed penalties for illegal wildlife trade in the ESA. Members, Mr. Louis Ng, Mr. Leon Pereira, and Mr. Yipon Huing, all have observed that illegal wildlife trade can make for very lucrative businesses and asked if the penalties for illegal wildlife trade could therefore be further enhanced to increase deterrence. For example, by raising the proposed imprisonment term for individuals who illegally trade in Appendix 2 or 3 species from 4 years to 5 years, as suggested by Mr. Yipon Huing, and increasing the maximum aggregate fine further across the board to 3 times the market value of the goods. First, I agree with members on the need for adequate penalties, and that is why we have further enhanced our penalty framework following feedback from public consultation exercise we went through earlier. We will increase the fines and jail terms that can be meted out for individuals who illegally trade in CITES species, as well as penalties for the domestic trade in CITES species to align with that for international trade. We have also introduced stiffer penalties for corporate offenders who illegally trade CITES species. These are corporations, unincorporated associations, or partnerships. In addition, the maximum aggregate fine will be raised across the board to match the market value of all illegally traded CITES species comprise an offence, where the market value is higher than the maximum aggregate fines of $500,000 or $1 million for individual and corporate offenders, respectively. So you can see that we are taking significant steps in raising the penalties from the current Act, while also providing greater clarity to existing penalties, such as specifying that the offender will be fined on the basis of each specimen of the CITES species comprised in the offence. But at the same time, we need to strike the right balance, ensuring that the penalties meted are proportionate to the offence and consistent with our domestic legislation. For example, we have proposed higher penalties in this Act as compared to the Wildlife Act that Mr. Yipon Huing mentioned, which covers common wildlife. This is in view that illegal trade in CITES species has a significantly high impact on the survival of these endangered species in the wild. In addition to pegging the maximum aggregate fine to the market value of the goods, we have also proposed a maximum aggregate fine of $1 million for corporate offenders. This allows the courts the flexibility to consider other aggravating factors and impose much higher penalties in cases where the market value of the goods is low. And this cap for the maximum aggregate fine for corporate offenders is proportionate to other serious offences in our domestic legislation. For example, the Corruption, Drug Trafficking and Other Serious Crimes Act, where corporate offenders may be subject to a fine of $1 million or twice the value of the benefits reaped for offences such as drug dealing. And moreover, it's not just about consistency with our domestic legislation. Importantly, the ESA gives effect to our commitment as a CITES party. It touches on Singapore's obligation as a CITES party to combat illegal wildlife trade. And as cited by Mr. Leon Pereira, we have indeed benchmarked our proposed framework against neighbouring jurisdictions in the region. I'd like to clarify, Mr. Pereira, that we are not the lowest in the region. With our bills, our penalties will be roughly on par with our neighbours. For example, the proposed range of 4 to 8 years for the maximum imprisonment term for illegal wildlife trade offences is comparable to Malaysia, which maximum imprisonment term is about 7 years. It's up to 7 years. This places Singapore on the middle end of the spectrum regionally. The Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar impose a maximum imprisonment term of up to 10 to 15 years, albeit with a significantly much lower monetary fine compared to our framework. Meanwhile, Cambodia, Laos, and Indonesia, the maximum imprisonment terms are up to 5 years. So we are not the lowest, comparable with our neighbouring jurisdictions. And much higher and stiffer financial penalties. In addition to that, we have introduced a differentiated heavier penalties for offences involving CITES Appendix 1 species, and is also aligned with jurisdictions such as Brunei, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. In addition to this, the bill will introduce provisions to allow for the seizure or forfeiture of items used to conceal CITES species, as well as their conveyances. This will serve to further deter illegal wildlife trade, as would-be smugglers will face a prospect of losing their vehicles, as well as any additional cargo that was used to commit the offence. In a nutshell, we are taking steps to significantly raise the penalties. At the same time, we are mindful that the penalties need to be proportionate to the offence and are broadly consistent with other domestic legislation, as well as comparable with our neighbours. And I would like to assure members that we will continue to review our penalty framework to ensure that it serves as a sufficient deterrent against illegal wildlife trade. Members have also pointed out that it will be important to reduce consumer demand of illegally traded CITES species by targeting buyers. Although buyers of illegally traded CITES species can already be penalized under the Act, members such as Mr. Louis Ng suggested to explicitly include the act of buying as an offence in the Act. This was also a suggestion raised during our public consultation exercise, which we have considered carefully. Although buying is not explicitly set out as an offence in our legislation, Mr. Yip Mong Huing had also pointed out there are other levers that penalise buyers of illegally traded CITES species, and MPARCS has taken enforcement action using these levers. For example, under Section 4 of the ESA, any person in possession of a CITES species that has been illegally imported is guilty of an offence. This includes possession of such a species purchased from a seller. Under Section 19 of the ESA, any person who abets the commission of any offence under the ESA is also guilty of an offence. This means that buyers can be penalised for facilitating the sale of illegally traded CITES species, including CITES species that cannot be sold, such as elephant ivory and rhinoceros horns. And over the last 5 years, MPARC has used these provisions to charge 8 persons for possession of illegally traded CITES species and 3 persons for facilitating the sale of such species. I'd like to assure members that MPARCS will continue to be vigilant on this front and exercise these levers to tackle this issue. At the same time, we are mindful that there may also be persons who are unsuspecting purchasers of illegally traded CITES species. Most of the general public might not be able to differentiate between CITES species and non-CITES species, much less be able to verify if the species was traded legally. Hence, we aim to tackle this issue upstream. MPARCS conducts regular checks on businesses and individuals who sell CITES species to ensure that they have the relevant permits for the species. Just last year, MPARCS carried out 2 island-wide operations and seized more than 90 wildlife specimens, including some CITES species from sellers who had listed them on social media and e-commerce platforms. These online sellers did not have the relevant permits for the CITES species. So I'd like to assure members that we are paying close attention to such illegally traded CITES species on online platforms, including e-commerce platforms. Mr. Yip Hong Wing asked if online sellers would be prosecuted as a business or commercial entity even if they did not have a business registration. In the case that I just mentioned, based on MPARC's investigations, the online sellers were persons who were keeping the wildlife as pets or breeding them at home for sale. They are individuals with no registered businesses and will be dealt with accordingly under the ESA. Also, in response to Mr. Yip's comments, I'd like to clarify that there are CITES species that can be kept as pets in Singapore, but only with permission and the relevant permits from MPARCS. Whether CITES species can be kept as pets is based on several factors, including the potential impact to animal and public health, animal welfare, environmental impact, and public safety. MPARC regularly reviews the suitability of these wildlife species as pets. So apart from regulating the wildlife trade in Singapore, we also regulate the keeping of wildlife as pets to safeguard animal welfare and health. We also aim to maintain a balanced ecosystem which can be disrupted when non-native wildlife is illegally abandoned or released into our green and blue spaces. NParks receives tips-offs and monitors online and social media platforms for cases of illegally kept wildlife and will not hesitate to take strict action. For example, in 2020, NParks charged an individual for the illegal possession and sale of a boa constrictor, which is listed in CITES Appendix 2 on the online messaging service Telegram. The individual was later fined $1,000. With the amendments proposed in this bill, such offenders will be subject to stiffer penalties, including a monetary fine of up to $100,000 and a maximum imprisonment term of up to 6 years for sale and advertisement of illegally traded CITES species. This is in addition to our work with enforcement agencies and the industry to ensure that all CITES species are legally traded in Singapore. Our partnerships also play an important role to enhance our measures to combat illegal wildlife trade, including to bolster our capabilities to tackle new forms of illegal wildlife trade, such as recent shift of the trade to online platforms, as Mr. Yip Hong Wing highlighted. Let me just touch on this item as part of our investigation and enforcement regime under the ESA. Today, NParks works closely with the industry, such as e-commerce platforms and online auction houses, to combat the illegal trade of CITES species online. Mr. Yip suggested we hold the digital platforms accountable for removing content advertising and facilitating the sale of illegally traded CITES species. And we regularly engage this platform to raise awareness on the impact of illegal wildlife trade and educate these stakeholders on how they can contribute to our efforts to prevent the online trade of these products. Thus far, the industry has been cooperative and committed to prevent the illegal sale of these products on their platforms. Mr. Yip referenced the Digital Services Act. The European Parliament and Council reached an agreement on this set of new rules only earlier this year. And from what we understand, it has not been formally approved. We will continue to monitor this space. NParks also works closely with enforcement agencies and international organizations, tapping on their expertise and experience to complement its capabilities and resources in tracking down illegal wildlife traders online. For example, NParks works with the Singapore Police Force to extract information from digital devices that may be helpful in our investigation. NParks also has a group of well-trained enforcement officers to tackle illegal wildlife trade. These officers are trained in implementation of CITES provisions, the identification of CITES species, investigative methods, and the use of technology to aid enforcement. These officers also attend international conferences and workshops, including those organized by Interpol on combating cyber-enabled wildlife crime. So they kept up with developments in this field, as well as share best practices with one another. Mr. Louis Ng asked if we could include a reward to incentivize informants to make reports drawn from fines imposed under the ESA. I thank Mr. Ng for his suggestion. Indeed, NParks will receive tip-offs from time to time to enforce against illegal wildlife trafficking. And that is why we have made amendments to protect the identity of these informants, which may encourage more persons to provide information about such illegal activities. We are in the midst of exploring the feasibility of a reward program to further encourage informants to step forward. We are reviewing the approaches taken by other agencies, such as the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. We will continue to explore the implementation of such a program administratively. Let me also take a chance to clarify on a few points that were raised by Mr. Leon Pereira. One around the Bengal cat. Mr. Pereira, I think, may have misinterpreted or heard my earlier speech wrongly. Today, the Bengal cat, which is a cross between the wild Asian leopard cat and which is a CITES-listed species, and the domestic cat. Today, although traders do not need to produce a permit when trading Bengal cats, they have been cooperative and are doing so. The amendments to the Act will make this come into force, and they will have to, as a requirement, provide these permits moving forward. So just to clarify the point that Mr. Leon Pereira raised just now. The second point that Mr. Pereira also raised was about the going beyond the CITES agreements to have, for example, reverse listings, to think about different species that are not currently under the CITES schedules. Maybe allow me just to clarify with Mr. Pereira that CITES currently in the world is the only international agreement under the United Nations framework that regulates the trade of endangered species. And it's the international body where almost all the countries sign up to as CITES, parties of CITES agreement to enforce these regulations for sustainable trade in these endangered species. So CITES is the main vehicle in which these rules and regulations are enforced and implemented across the world. And the ESA intent is to give force as for Singapore as a CITES party to enforce these rules as a responsible member of the CITES agreement. And on his point about taking leadership in ASEAN, I'm very glad to share with Mr. Pereira that indeed we are taking leadership as far as we can within the region. For example, earlier in my speech, I said that we set up the Center for Wildlife Forensics, which became a CITES reference laboratory under the CITES framework. In March earlier this year, NPARK's Youth Stewards, under the Youth Stewards for Nature program, also organized a World Wildlife Day regional youth symposium, bringing youth from across the region come together to discuss these issues, think about solutions, and work together as one community. So indeed, we are playing our part in the region and taking our leadership role as well as we can with our members in our region. And I welcome all the young people sitting up there too as well to join our programs, the Youth Stewards for Nature programs. Let me just touch on the last part of the questions that were raised by the various members, which are on the overall scope of the ESA. Mr. Yip Hong Wing asked if the scope of the ESA could be expanded to include non-CITES species or streamline the Wildlife Act to regulate all wildlife matters in Singapore. Today, NPARKS oversees various acts which deal with different aspects of animal-related policies. The ESA regulates the trade of animal and plant species listed under CITES in Singapore. This primarily tackles the international trade in the species and affirms our international commitment as a party to CITES. The Wildlife Act, on the other hand, ensures the protection, preservation, and management of Singapore's wildlife. So these pieces of legislation have different but complementary functions. They come together to support our efforts to safeguard animal health and welfare. It is important that we have a strong and robust legislative framework underpinning our efforts to tackle wildlife crime, and that's why we continue to review and update our legislation. The Wildlife Act, previously named the Wild Animals and Birds Act, was amended and came to force in June 2020. And now we are also amending the ESA to keep pace with the times and ensure that we can continue to effectively combat all forms of illegal wildlife trade in Singapore. Let me now move on to other issues that were raised on tackling illegal wildlife trade that went beyond the ESA scope. To enhance our levers to combat illegal wildlife trade, Mr. Yip Hong Wing and Mr. Louis Ng asked for illegal wildlife trade to be recognized as a serious organized crime in Singapore, and I thank the members for their suggestions. The Organised Crime Act, or OCA, provides law enforcement agencies powers to act against organized crime and is focused on criminalizing activities that are of greatest concern to Singapore. I note Mr. Louis Ng's point on the potential threats of illegal wildlife trade to public health, wildlife ecology, and its use in international money laundering. These are valid considerations. I also thank Mr. Louis Ng for sharing with us your position paper that you have put together with academics and the NGOs, and I have shared that with my fellow colleagues, and we will review and assess these with the relevant agencies. Beyond legislation and enforcement, we agree with Mr. Yip Hong Wing that public education and outreach is key in combating illegal wildlife trade and in safeguarding animal health and welfare in Singapore. We will continue to engage the community to raise awareness on Singapore's role on this front, and in turn reduce demand for illegally sourced wildlife products in Singapore, including those sold on virtual platforms. For example, we've embarked on webinars and exhibitions to educate the public on best practices as consumers, such as how they can identify and purchase legal CITES products. NPARKS and the Worldwide Fund, or WWF, for Nature Singapore have jointly organized roundtable discussions with the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online, which includes digital platforms such as Facebook or Meta, TikTok, Lazada, and Carousel to raise awareness on the illegal sale of exotic pets online. In January this year, they also jointly engaged over 80 representatives from the shipping industry to share best practices for tackling the illegal trade in wildlife. Last but not least, MPARKS involves youth in efforts to tackle illegal wildlife trade as part of the Youth Stewards program, which I mentioned earlier. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, let me conclude by thanking the members once again for their support and suggestions, and our partners and stakeholders for the feedback and support in our review of the ESA. Overall, the amendments will help to strengthen our regulation for the trade of CITES species and to enhance our penalties and enforcement powers against such illegal trade. Weeding out illegal trade in CITES listed species requires a concerted effort of all stakeholders. The fight also goes beyond Singapore and requires strong cooperation at the bilateral, regional, and international levels. We will continue to partner with the international community and with our local stakeholders and the community to combat illegal wildlife trade and safeguard our planet's natural heritage. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I believe I addressed all the questions and suggestions from the members, and I beg to move.
The question, firstly, any clarifications? Yes, Mr. Lewis Ng.
Thank you, Senator. I thank SMS for a very detailed response, but could I just have two clarifications? One, on making buying an offence. I know that it is currently covered under ESA, but the call from the NGOs really is to make it specific. So Section 4 of ESA really states many words: import, export, re-export, sell, advertise. Why not just add that one word, buy? If you could understand what is the concerns from the government instead of just adding that one word. Second, on the reward for informers, I did it through a private member's bill to introduce Section 13 into the Wildlife Act, which does provide reward to informers for people who are in possession or trading in less endangered species. So it'll be a bit strange now. We provide you a reward if you give us a tip-off for less protected animals, but we don't legislate it and give you a reward if you give us tip-offs for more protected or endangered animals. And I really hope we can close that loophole. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think Mr. Lewis Ng raised 2 points. One about the insertion of the explicit mention of buying as an offence under the Act. As I explained earlier, it is an offence to purchase illegally sourced, traded CITES species. And we have actually enforced these levers previously under the existing Act even today. On the other hand, I think we are also mindful of sending a signal that actually there are many people, general public, who may not be able to recognize what is a CITES listed species, what's a non-CITES listed species, what is illegally traded or not. And we don't want to send a wrong signal to those members of public as well. So I just want to assure the member that we've considered this carefully as part of the public consultation feedback that I personally had with many of the NGOs and many of the focus groups. I understand the concerns. And I think if there's an issue about signaling to consumers and buyers that they have to be careful and be mindful of what they purchase and where they purchase from, that I agree. And we continue to do public education and awareness and consumer awareness campaigns. We will continue to work on those issues. Second point that you raised was around the award for the informers. I mentioned in my clarification that we are exploring and reviewing this framework, and we are not close to this idea. So give us some time. We are looking into this. It's an important area, and that's why we have moved in this Act, in this amendment, to protect the identity of such informers, because we rely on tip-offs and many of these informers to give us the tips and the information for us to do our operations and enforcement. So, to Mr. Lewis Ng's second clarification, just to assure you, we are looking into this area.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Endangered Species Import and Export Amendment Bill.
Committee stage what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself in the committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 16 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister for National Development.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Endangered Species Import and Export Amendment Bill.
Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 1:30 p.m. tomorrow.
The question is that Parliament do now stand adjourned to 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. Ms. Nadia Ahmad Samdin.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I need to move first.
Very well.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn.